In the worst of the storm, veteran Dylan Foster and his canine, Ghost, sprinted through the dark forest toward a flickering glow. A private plane was down, and the overwhelming smell of aviation fuel choked the air. Dylan's combat experience screamed that it was about to explode. He ordered Ghost to fall back, but for the first time, the dog ignored him. Ghost lunged toward the burning cockpit, barking and clawing frantically at a pile of twisted metal. The dog had scented something underneath. Dylan realized Ghost hadn't found a body. He was trying to save someone who was still alive, and they had only seconds before the whole thing blew. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The rain in this part of the Oregon Coast Range was not a gentle mist. It was an assault. It fell with a percussive, unending rhythm, turning the gray clay of the farmyard into a thick, clinging mud that seemed determined to pull the whole world down into it. The farmhouse itself, a two-story structure that might have been handsome in 1973, was losing its fight. Its white paint had surrendered to peeling gray blisters, and the porch sagged with a permanent, weary sigh. Inside, Dylan Foster sat at a scarred oak table, the only light coming from a single yellow bulb overhead. The light flickered in time with the wind that sent a low, keening howl through the eaves. Dylan matched the house, worn down, weathered, and isolated. He was a tall man, still strong in the shoulders from his old life, but a deep thinness had settled into him. His brown hair, longer than regulation, was streaked with silver at the temples. A thick, untrimmed beard and mustache, mostly brown with hints of gray, covered a face that was etched with lines of wind and worry. But his eyes, when they caught the light, were a clear, kind gray. He wore his daily uniform, a faded gray t-shirt under a heavy flannel overshirt, this one a plaid of navy blue, gray, and dull beige, that he never bothered to button. In front of him sat a pile of envelopes, the final reminders. He picked one up, the paper damp and soft in his hand. The red ink of the past due stamp was stark. This one was from the hospital system in Portland. This one was from the oncology department. This one was for Samantha. He closed his eyes. The name was a ghost in his throat, a memory he held so tightly it threatened to break him. Samantha, gone 3 years now. The cancer had taken her slowly, and the cost of that slow departure had taken everything else. The farm was mortgaged to its rotting support beams. The medical debt was a mountain he could never hope to climb, an avalanche perpetually frozen in the moment before it buried him. His breath hitched, the old, familiar tightness seizing his chest. The air in the kitchen felt too thick to breathe, too thin to matter. His right hand, resting on the table, began to tremble. It started as a fine tremor, a vibration from a machine deep inside him, a relic of his time as a combat engineer. He had seen too many things, and the echoes never truly left. He stared at the shaking hand, disconnected from it, a spectator to his own betrayal. Then, a presence. A low, soft whine, more a vibration than a sound, cut through the noise of the storm. A heavy head pressed firmly against his thigh. Dylan opened his eyes, his gaze dropping from the threatening paper to the animal beside him. Ghost looked up at him, his ears at half-mast, his dark eyes filled with a profound, knowing intelligence. Ghost was a German shepherd, but not the common black and tan. He was a rare silver sable, a coat of shifting gray and white that had earned him his name. He was large for the breed, well over 90 pounds, and at 7 years old, he was in his prime. He was a former canine retired from service, but he had never truly clocked out. His job had simply changed. Dylan's hand was still shaking. Ghost saw it. He nudged the hand with his cold, wet nose, a sharp, insistent push. When the shaking didn't stop, the dog rose. He placed his heavy front paws on Dylan's lap and pushed his great, noble head under Dylan's trembling hand, forcing the man to acknowledge him. "I'm okay, boy," Dylan whispered, his voice rough from disuse. Ghost knew he was lying. The dog pushed closer, stepping between Dylan's knees and resting his chin on the man's chest, applying a steady, comforting pressure. This was his training. This was his purpose. He was a living anchor, designed to hold Dylan Foster to the present, to keep the past from drowning him. Dylan's breathing instinctively slowed, matching the dog's rhythmic huffs. He wrapped his arms around the shepherd's thick ruff, burying his face in the coarse, damp fur that smelled of pine and rain. The shaking subsided. The panic receded, pushed back by the simple, undeniable fact of the creature in his arms. "What would I do without you, huh?" Dylan murmured, his grip tightening. Ghost simply leaned into him, a solid, unwavering force against the chaos. A sharp cracking sound from the ceiling, distinct from the howl of the wind, made them both look up. A new dark spot was forming on the plaster above the sink. A second later, a steady drip, faster than the one in the corner, began to strike the countertop. Dylan sighed, pushing himself up. Ghost dropped back to all fours, his claws clicking lightly on the worn linoleum as he shadowed the man. "Another one," Dylan said to the dog, as if discussing a problem with a partner. "We're going to need the big bucket." He walked to the utility porch, the floorboards groaning under his work boots. He felt the weight of the farm settling on him again. The roof was rotting, the foundation was sinking, the debt was suffocating. He was failing. He was failing the memory of Samantha. He was failing the one good thing he had left. He grabbed an old 5-gallon bucket and returned to the kitchen, placing it on the counter. The sound of the water hitting the plastic bottom was a new, unwelcome instrument in the storm's orchestra. He stood there for a long time, just listening to the two drips and the wind, a prisoner in his own collapsing home. Suddenly, Ghost stiffened. It was not his usual calming posture. This was an alert. His head snapped toward the front of the house, his ears shooting forward, rigid. A low, menacing rumble started deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Dylan asked, his own senses instantly sharpening, the fog of depression lifting to be replaced by the old, cold focus of the soldier. Ghost ignored him. He moved silently to the living room, planting himself in front of the picture window, his body a tense silhouette against the lightning flashes. He was staring, unblinking, into the dark forest that bordered the property line, a dense wall of fir and pine. A deep, insistent bark erupted from Ghost's chest. It was not a "someone is here" bark. It was a "something is wrong" bark. "Ghost, quiet," Dylan commanded, moving to the window, his eyes straining to see past the curtain of rain. He saw nothing, just the black, thrashing trees and the silver sheets of water. "It's just the wind, boy!" Ghost barked again, louder this time, a sound full of urgency. He ran from the window to Dylan, pushed his nose hard against the man's hand, and then ran to the front door, scratching at the wood. "You want to go out? In this?" Ghost let out a sharp yelp and ran back, grabbing the cuff of Dylan's plaid shirt in his teeth. He didn't pull hard, just a firm, insistent tug. "Come. Now." Okay, I'm coming." Dylan's skin prickled. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. Ghost had saved his life a dozen times from himself. He wouldn't ignore him when he warned of something else. Dylan grabbed his old, worn brown leather jacket from the peg by the door, shoving his arms into it. He flipped the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. The wind tore the door from his grip, slamming it open against the farmhouse wall. Rain and leaves blasted the entryway. Ghost didn't hesitate. He bounded onto the porch, barking wildly into the night, not at the yard, but up toward the sky. Dylan stepped out onto the sagging porch, pulling his collar tight. "Ghost, get back here. What in the hell are you—" He stopped. Over the shriek of the wind, he heard it. It was not the wind. It was a roar, a high-pitched mechanical scream that was getting louder, closer, and horribly, terribly lower. Ghost was frantic now, spinning in circles on the porch before barking once more, a single sharp command toward the forest. Then Dylan saw it. A brief flash of light through the trees, unnatural and moving too fast. The mechanical roar became a low, tearing boom, a sound of metal failing. It was followed by a deafening crash that shook the very ground beneath their feet, a sound that momentarily eclipsed the storm itself. Silence. Then, through the trees, maybe a mile away, a new light flickered. An angry, hungry orange light. Dylan Foster stood frozen, the rain lashing his face. Ghost was silent beside him, a statue of pure, focused attention. The orange glow in the forest brightened. For one long second, Dylan Foster was gone. The man consumed by debt and grief, the man who stared at the water stains on his ceiling, vanished. In his place, the combat engineer returned. The orange glow in the forest was a problem. The percussive crash was a data point. The rain and wind were just tactical weather. "Ghost, heel!" he commanded. His voice, which had been a rough whisper for weeks, was now a sharp, clear instrument of command. Ghost immediately abandoned his frantic barking and fell into position at Dylan's left heel, his body tense but waiting for instruction. Dylan turned and moved back into the house, his movements economical. There was no panic, only process. He bypassed the kitchen and went to the hall closet, pulling down a heavy, olive-drab canvas bag. The stenciled white cross on its side was faded and cracked with age, but the contents were maintained. It was his old field trauma kit. He grabbed a long, heavy flashlight from the utility drawer, checking the beam. It was strong. "All right, boy, let's go." He stepped back onto the porch and into the storm. The wind nearly ripped the door from his hand, but he was already moving, his long strides eating up the muddy ground of the yard as he headed for the tree line. Ghost ran ahead, a silent gray-white flash in the darkness, stopping every 20 yards to look back, ensuring his human was following. The forest, usually his refuge, was now an obstacle course. The path was a river of ankle-deep mud and slick, decaying leaves. Thorny branches whipped at his face, and the sound of the storm was amplified under the canopy, a constant, deafening roar. But Dylan's focus was absolute. His military training had hardwired his brain for this. Move, assess, solve. The cold rain, the screaming wind, the aching exhaustion in his bones, they were all just noise. Ghost was the signal. The dog moved with a purpose that was terrifying in its intensity, his powerful nose to the ground, pulling him toward the smell of smoke and fuel that now cut sharply through the wet earth scent of the storm. After 10 minutes of brutal hiking, they burst into a small clearing, one Dylan usually avoided. It was a scar of old logging, filled with rotting stumps. Now it was a scene from a nightmare. A small, single-engine private plane, sleek and white, was torn in half. The main fuselage was crumpled against a massive Douglas fir, and the wings were shredded, scattered like broken toys. The engine block was on fire, a furious, hissing blaze that fought against the deluge. The smell of aviation fuel was overwhelming, a chemical tang that made Dylan's stomach clench. He knew that smell. It was the scent that came seconds before an explosion. "Ghost, search!" Dylan shouted over the noise. He didn't need to. The shepherd was already working. While Dylan scanned the wreckage for movement, Ghost was scrambling over a section of the fuselage toward the crushed cockpit. He stopped, planted his front paws on the twisted metal, and let out a single, sharp bark. Then he began to dig. "Here! Ghost has one!" Dylan yelled, though there was no one to hear him. He scrambled up the muddy embankment, the flashlight beam cutting through the rain. Ghost was furiously pushing aside debris, a backpack, a map case, a piece of paneling, from a space near the pilot's seat. Dylan dropped the medical bag and shined the light into the wreckage. He saw a hand. Pale skin, slender fingers. It was wedged between the seat and a buckled section of the control panel. "I see you! I'm here!" Dylan roared. He tore at the metal with his bare hands, the cold aluminum slicing into his palms, but he didn't feel it. He braced his boot against the fir tree and pulled, the metal groaning in protest. He created a gap, just big enough to see inside. A woman was slumped in the pilot's seat. Dark hair was plastered across her face, matted with rain and blood from a gash on her forehead. She was wearing a simple, dark pantsuit, now soaked and torn. She was unconscious, held in place only by her seatbelt. "Ghost, back!" Dylan ordered. The dog instantly retreated to a safe distance, watching with unbearable intensity. Dylan fought with the buckle. It was jammed. Cursing under his breath, he pulled his old utility knife from his jeans pocket and sliced through the nylon webbing. The woman's body slumped forward. Dylan lunged into the opening, ignoring the sharp metal edges digging into his ribs, and hooked his arms under hers. "Come on, we gotta go." He pulled. She was caught. Her foot was trapped. At that same moment, the fire at the front of the plane gave a sudden, hungry whoosh. The flames doubled in size, licking at the cockpit. "No time," Dylan grunted. He put his full weight into it, wrenching her body sideways. There was a sickening snap of metal, and her foot came free. He hauled her dead weight out of the opening and tumbled backward down the muddy slope, shielding her body with his own. They landed in a heap at the bottom of the embankment. Dylan had her, but he knew they weren't clear. "Cover!" he yelled, grabbing the woman by the collar of her jacket and dragging her backward toward a massive fallen log that formed one edge of the clearing. Ghost was already there, barking, urging them on. They were 3 feet from the log when the fuel tank went. It wasn't a Hollywood fireball. It was a deafening concussion, a sound that felt like a punch to the chest. The air was sucked from Dylan's lungs. A wave of intense heat washed over his back, and the rainy night was lit up with a brilliant, terrible flash of white and orange. Debris, shrapnel, pieces of metal, and burning fragments rained down around them. Dylan curled his body over the woman, his head tucked, his leather jacket taking the brunt of the smaller impacts, just as he had been trained. Then, as quickly as it came, it was over. The only sounds were the steady drumming of the rain and the furious, dying hiss of the wreckage. Dylan lay still for a moment, his ears ringing. He pushed himself up, his arms shaking from exertion. The woman was still, her face pale in the darkness. "Okay," he breathed, the first word he'd spoken to himself. "Okay." His training shifted from rescue to medical. He unslung the canvas bag and flipped it open. His hands were steady now, all traces of the tremor gone. "Ghost, watch." The shepherd immediately lay down, forming a barrier between the woman and the burning wreck, his eyes scanning the dark tree line. Dylan's flashlight beam found the woman's injuries. The gash on her forehead was bleeding freely, but it was shallow. Her right arm, however, was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle below the elbow. "All right," he said softly, more to her than to himself. "Let's get you patched up." He worked with a practiced, detached efficiency. He cleaned the head wound with an antiseptic wipe and applied a pressure bandage. He then retrieved 2 rigid splints and a roll of gauze from his kit. With gentle, expert hands, he aligned the broken bones in her forearm. She moaned, a low sound in her throat, but didn't wake, and immobilized the limb, wrapping it tightly from elbow to wrist. He checked her breathing. It was shallow, but regular. Her pulse was thready, but strong. Shock, and the cold. The rain was relentless, and her body temperature would be dropping fast. He pulled a foil emergency blanket from his kit and wrapped it around her, the crinkling sound loud in the sudden quiet. But he knew it wasn't enough. "Ghost," he said, his voice soft now. "Here, boy. Watch her." He didn't need to say, "Keep her warm." He just knew the dog would. Ghost seemed to understand the change in mission. The canine guardian relaxed, his tense, alert posture softening. He crawled forward on his belly, nudged Dylan's hand aside, and sniffed the woman's bandaged head. He then circled once and lay down against her back, pressing his massive, 90-pound body firmly against her, a living furnace of fur and muscle. He tucked his head over her shoulder, his own breath warming her neck. Dylan sat back on his heels, the rain dripping from his hair. He looked at the scene, the burning skeletal remains of the plane, the unconscious woman wrapped in silver foil, and his dog, his only friend, curled around her like a protector. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and the cold was seeping back into his own bones. He knew with a sinking feeling that the night was far from over. He couldn't leave her here. The nearest road was 2 miles away, and no ambulance could get through this. He carefully slid his arms under the woman's back and knees, testing her weight. She was light. He grunted as he stood, stabilizing himself in the thick mud. "Okay, Ghost, we're moving. Home." Dylan Foster, the man who had been drowning in his own kitchen an hour ago, began the long walk back through the storm, carrying a stranger. Ghost led the way, a silent gray shepherd, guiding them out of the wreckage and toward the dim, distant light of the farmhouse. The storm was a living thing, and it did not want to die. Dylan had laid the unconscious woman on the old sofa, the one that had been Samantha's. It felt like a violation, but the floor was cold and his own bed was unthinkable. He and Ghost had kept the vigil. Dylan, soaked to the bone, sat in his armchair opposite the sofa, his old field trauma kit open on the floor. Ghost lay between the chair and the sofa, a 90-pound tripwire, his head up, his eyes fixed on the woman. For hours, the only sounds were the wind's howl, the steady, maddening drip of the new leak, and the woman's shallow breathing. Dylan had managed to get a thick wool blanket from Samantha's old chest, one that smelled of cedar, not of dog or mildew, and covered her. He'd checked the splint on her arm. It was secure. He must have dozed, because he was jerked awake by Ghost standing, his head cocked. The deep rumble of the storm was still present, but a new sound was trying to muscle its way in. It was a sound Dylan knew well, a low, rhythmic thumping that fought against the wind. A helicopter. He was on his feet and at the door in a second. He pulled it open, and the wind, though no longer carrying a wall of water, almost tore it from his hand. He stepped onto the porch. Dawn was a weak gray smear on the horizon. The rain had eased to a furious drizzle, but the wind was worse, a wild, unpredictable force that tore at the trees. Through the mist, he saw it. A small red and white medical helicopter, fighting every gust, descending slowly toward the one open field he kept mowed. The landing was not a landing, it was a controlled crash. The skids slammed into the mud, and the aircraft shuddered violently before the rotors began to slow. Two figures, bundled in bright orange, jumped out and ran, hunched against the wind, toward the house. Dylan met them on the porch. The first to arrive was a woman in her mid-40s, her face set in lines of pure, no-nonsense competence. She wore a dark blue EMT uniform and carried a heavy medical pack. "Where is she?" the woman, Caroline Morgan, asked, her voice a professional shout over the wind. "In here," Dylan said, stepping aside. The second person was a man. He was younger, dressed in a sharp black suit that was already being ruined by mud and rain. He wore a clear earpiece, and his eyes, unlike Caroline's, were not on the house. They were on Dylan. Jared Monroe was his name, though Dylan didn't know it yet. He was tall, fit, and his gaze was cold and assessing as he cleared the porch, scanning the woods and the barn before finally entering. Ghost was on his feet, a low, almost inaudible rumble vibrating in his chest. He stood between Dylan and the newcomers. "Ghost? Easy? At ease," Dylan said quietly. The dog sat, but the rumble did not stop. Caroline Morgan was already at the sofa, her hands moving with practiced speed. "Good splint," she muttered, glancing at Dylan's work. "Vitals are thready? Definitely a concussion." She attached a pulse oximeter to the woman's finger and began preparing an IV. Jared Monroe, however, stood by the door, his back to the wall, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the peeling paint, the worn furniture, the stack of past-due bills on the table, and the large, silent shepherd who had not taken its eyes off him. "I'm on her security detail," Jared said to Dylan, his voice flat. "The main team is on the road, or they were." He tapped his earpiece, then pulled out a satellite phone, his expression souring. "How's the patient?" he called to Caroline. "She's stable, but I'm not risking a transport in this." Caroline gestured to the window where the trees were bending at alarming angles. "The wind shear is too high. It was a miracle we landed. Taking off with a head trauma patient is a death sentence." Jared cursed, turning to his phone. "Well, that settles it." He looked at Dylan, his gaze one of annoyance, as if this whole situation was Dylan's fault. "I just got off the line. The ground team is blocked. A massive landslide on the 26. They're trying to find a back route through the logging roads, but they're guessing 48 hours. Best case. We're stuck here." A low moan came from the sofa. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were dark, intelligent, and, in that first second, utterly lost. Then they focused. She was a woman in her mid-30s, and even with her matted hair and the bloody drying bandage on her forehead, she radiated an aura of command. "Where?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "You're safe," Caroline said gently, leaning into her eyeline. "My name is Caroline Morgan. I'm a paramedic. Your plane crashed. You're in a farmhouse in Oregon." The woman's eyes darted past the medic, past Jared, and landed on Dylan. They were sharp, analytical, even in their confusion. "Who are you?" "This is Mr. Foster," Caroline said. "He pulled you from the wreckage." The woman, Natalie Rivers, looked at Dylan, but there was no gratitude in her eyes. There was only a sudden, dawning horror. She tried to sit up, a sharp cry of pain escaping as her broken arm and concussed head protested. "No," she gasped, falling back. "Ma'am, you need to stay still," Caroline insisted. But Natalie was frantic. Her eyes were wide, her breathing accelerating. "No, the plane, the case, the silver case. It was on the co-pilot's seat. Where is it? Where is Valkyrie?" Her panic was palpable, but it wasn't for her life. It was for something else. "Ma'am, there was nothing," Dylan said, his voice quiet. He felt the need to be gentle, to deliver the news as he would to a new widow. "There wasn't time. The plane, it exploded. Everything was lost." The words struck Natalie harder than the crash itself. The fight drained out of her. The panic was replaced by a vast, hollow despair. "Lost," she whispered, turning her face toward the back of the old sofa. "It's all lost." Caroline sedated her lightly, and Natalie drifted back into an uneasy, medicated sleep. During the entire exchange, Jared Monroe had been silent, watching. Now he stepped outside onto the porch, his phone in his hand. He told Caroline he was going to try to find a better signal, to coordinate with the ground team. Ghost, who had been watching Jared with a fixed, suspicious gaze, padded to the window and watched him through the glass. Jared walked to the edge of the property near the dilapidated barn. He wasn't looking for a signal. He had one. He raised his phone, his back to the house. He quickly snapped 3 photos, one of the isolated farmhouse itself, one of Dylan's old muddy truck with the license plate clearly visible, and one of the barn. He then pretended to check the window seals on the side of the house, angling the phone to get a covert shot of the living room. The photo caught Dylan standing by the fire, a tall, imposing figure with the massive gray shepherd sitting faithfully at his feet. He moved behind the woodshed, out of sight. He typed a quick, encrypted message to a number not in his contacts. "Target is alive. Secure at secondary location, a farm. Medics have her, but we're pinned down by weather. The package, Valkyrie, is confirmed lost in the fire. But there's a complication. A local, ex-military by the look of him, with a canine. He pulled her out, sending images, awaiting instructions. JM." He attached the photos and pressed send. The message, routed through a secure server, was on its way to Derek Miles. Jared slid the phone back into his pocket, his expression unchanged. He was just a concerned employee, checking the perimeter. He walked back to the house, carefully wiping the mud from his expensive shoes before stepping inside. As he entered, Ghost rose silently from the floor. The shepherd did not bark. He did not growl. He simply stood in the center of the room, a 90-pound obstacle, and watched Jared Monroe. The man was in his territory now, and the dog knew, with an instinct older than words, that he was looking at an enemy. The 48 hours that followed felt like a siege. The farmhouse, a tiny, fragile island in a world of mud and mist, became a compressed world of its own. The storm had broken, but the power lines, predictably, had not survived. The silence that followed the wind's retreat was heavy and absolute, broken only by the steady dripping of water from the ruined roof. "My equipment's batteries won't last forever," Caroline Morgan announced on the first morning, her voice clipped with professional concern. She was checking the readouts on a portable vital signs monitor. "And the backup batteries in the medevac are for the flight systems. I need a stable power source to keep this running and to keep her warm." Natalie Rivers, awake now, was propped up on the sofa, her face pale but her dark eyes alert. Her arm was in a proper sling and the bandage on her head was clean. She said nothing, but her gaze missed nothing. Jared Monroe, the security man, was on his satellite phone by the window, his voice a low, frustrated murmur. "I don't care about the mud. I care about extraction. Get the team. No, I am not. Just find a way." He was tense, coiled, and his eyes kept flicking to Ghost. Dylan Foster looked at the medic's equipment, then at the cold, dark kitchen. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "There's a generator in the barn." "Does it work?" Caroline asked, skeptical. "It did in 2011, Dylan said, pulling on his boots. "Gave up on it when the fuel stabilizer got too expensive." He walked out the front door, and Ghost immediately rose to follow. "No, boy," Dylan commanded, his voice quiet. "Stay. Watch." Ghost sat, his posture rigid. He understood the command. He was not to guard Dylan. He was to guard the house. Natalie watched this silent exchange. A man gives a two-word order, and a 90-pound animal obeys without question. From her position on the sofa, she had a clear view through the living room window to the dilapidated barn. She watched as Dylan disappeared inside. Minutes later, he emerged, wrestling a large, heavy, grease-caked generator onto an old cart. He wheeled it into the relative shelter of the open-air woodshed, safe from the drizzle. For the next 2 hours, Natalie observed him. She was a CEO. Her entire life was built on assessing human assets, on spotting potential and leveraging it. She had initially dismissed Dylan as a simple, perhaps broken, recluse. She was wrong. She watched his hands. The hands that had trembled so violently in the kitchen the night of the crash were now steady and precise. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. There was no wasted effort, no frustration. He was diagnosing, disassembling, and cleaning components with a surgeon's focus. He cleaned the flooded carburetor, dried the magneto, and carefully gapped a new spark plug from a tin he'd kept in his pocket. Jared Monroe paced on the porch, his phone to his ear, a picture of useless, expensive anxiety. Dylan Foster, covered in mud and grease, was a study in absolute competence. He was, Natalie realized, an engineer, a high-level one. She had seen that focus before, in her own R&D labs. Finally, Dylan stood. He gave the generator's pull cord a single, powerful, committed rip. The engine sputtered, coughed a plume of blue smoke, and then, with a deep, rattling roar, it caught. A few minutes later, the single yellow bulb in the living room flickered and then burned bright, steady. Caroline Morgan's medical monitor beeped, its screen lit. A small electric heater in the corner began to glow orange. Dylan came back inside, wiping his black-stained hands on a rag. He met Natalie's gaze. She didn't thank him. She simply nodded, a sign of respect from one professional to another. He had solved the problem. Later that afternoon, the tension in the house began to rise. Jared was on his phone again, this time arguing, his voice sharp and low. "Just get it done. I don't care about the local PD. She is a non-issue. The asset is the... Just find it." Dylan was sitting at the oak table, cleaning his medical kit. The bag was open, the sterile, metallic-smelling items spread out on the wood. He was methodically repacking the gauze, checking the seals on the antiseptic wipes. The sound of Jared's voice, that specific cadence of a frustrated superior dressing down a subordinate, was the trigger. Dylan's hand, reaching for a roll of tape, stopped. It hovered, and then it began to shake. Natalie saw it. The tremor from the first night was back. Dylan pulled his hand back, clenching it into a fist, as if to physically stop the betrayal. His breathing became shallow, his gaze fixed on a knot in the wood table. He was not in the farmhouse. He was somewhere else, somewhere loud and hot, a place where an argument like that meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. He was losing his anchor. Before Natalie could even form a word, Ghost moved. The dog, who had been dozing, was on his feet in an instant. The change was remarkable. He whined a low, concerned sound and walked directly to Dylan. He didn't jump. He simply pushed his great head under Dylan's arm, forcing the limb to rest on his neck. Then he leaned. He put his full weight against Dylan's legs, a solid, warm, living pressure. He nudged the man's clenched fist with his cold nose. Once, twice. Dylan's fist uncurled. His fingers, almost by reflex, buried themselves in the thick gray fur of Ghost's ruff. Natalie watched, holding her own breath. She saw Dylan's shoulders, which had been rigid, begin to relax. She saw him inhale, a deep, shuddering breath, and then exhale slowly, his breath matching the dog's. Ghost did not move. He stayed, a living brace, until the trembling stopped completely, and Dylan's hand was just resting. "He's—" Natalie whispered, her voice barely audible. Dylan looked up, his eyes refocusing, finding her. He was embarrassed, but the fog was gone. "He's my partner," Dylan said simply. That evening, the silence was different. Jared was outside, near the generators, talking. Caroline was dozing in the armchair. "That's a bond I've never seen," Natalie said into the quiet. Her voice was no longer that of a CEO, but of a woman who had just witnessed something profound. Dylan looked at the fire he'd built in the hearth. He was a canine, now he's a medical discharge, like me. "You carry a heavy weight, Mr. Foster," she said, her voice soft. Dylan's gaze was distant. "We all carry what we have to." Natalie looked at her own hands, resting in her lap. Her good hand, her left, was steady. For now. But she knew the clock was ticking. She felt a sudden, strange kinship with this broken man. "I know what you mean," she said. "I'm racing against time myself. My project, Valkyrie. It's not just another product for my company. It's personal." She paused, choosing her words, offering a partial truth that felt like a confession. "There's a clock ticking for me, too. A very loud one. If I don't get this done—" She let the sentence hang in the air. Dylan looked from the fire to her. He saw the same desperation he felt, just in a different package. He nodded, accepting the confidence. The next morning, the 48-hour mark, the air was clear. The roads were still impassable, but the world felt less threatening. Natalie, desperate to move, paced the living room, a prisoner of the sofa. "I need air," she announced, pushing herself up, ignoring Caroline's protest. "I'm just going to the porch." She stepped outside, her good hand holding her slinged arm. The air was cold, clean, and smelled of wet pine. Ghost, who had been watching her every move, followed her out, sitting near the top of the porch steps. His true post was guarding Dylan, but his secondary directive was now this woman. Natalie walked to the far end of the porch, looking out at the ruined field where the medevac was still parked, a red and white scar. She felt helpless, a feeling she despised. She turned, pacing back. She stepped on a board near the corner. It was darker than the others, soft with years of rain and neglect. There was a sudden, sharp, splintering sound. The board gave way. Her foot plunged through, and her body pitched forward. She cried out, her good hand flying out to break her fall, a move that would have shattered her collarbone, or worse, put all her weight on her newly splinted broken arm. Before she could fall, before Dylan, who was already lunging from the kitchen doorway, could take a single step, Ghost moved. He was a gray-white blur. He didn't bark. He acted. He sprang forward, his powerful jaws clamping down, not on her arm, but on the thick, loose fabric of her jacket, just below the shoulder. He did not bite. He gripped, and he pulled. It was a trained canine maneuver, a non-violent rescue. He braced his paws on the solid wood and pulled backward with all his 90-pound-plus strength. The fabric strained, but it held. The pull was so sudden and so strong that it yanked Natalie clean off her feet, dragging her backward, away from the splintered, gaping hole. She landed hard on her back. On the solid part of the porch, the air knocked from her lungs. She lay there, stunned, staring at the gray sky. Dylan was kneeling over her, his face a mask of panic. "Natalie! Are you hit? "Are you okay?" He saw the hole, saw her, and saw Ghost, who had already released his grip and was now frantically licking her face, whining, his rescue mode switching instantly to comfort. I'm okay," Natalie gasped, the wind returning to her. Dylan helped her sit up. Her broken arm was safe, protected by the sling. Her good arm was fine. She was just bruised. She looked at the jagged, ugly hole where she had almost fallen, then at the dog. Ghost just whined again, pushing his wet nose into her hand. Natalie, the billionaire CEO, the woman who commanded boardrooms, began to tremble. She wrapped her good arm around the dog's massive neck and held on, burying her face in his fur. "That's twice," she whispered, her voice thick. "That's twice." She owed her life again to this man's dog. She realized with a strange, unnerving clarity, completely and totally in their debt. The arrival of the main team was not subtle. By the next afternoon, the impassable logging roads had been made passable by men who, Dylan suspected, were paid enough to make nature itself surrender. 2 black identical SUVs, gleaming with a wet-weather shine that was offensive in its perfection, crunched up the muddy track that Dylan called a driveway. They stopped, and 4 men in dark, tailored suits emerged. They were the same model as Jared Monroe, fit, alert, and wearing clear EAR pieces. One of them, older, with a military straight posture, gave Dylan a curt, professional nod. This, Dylan guessed, was the man in charge, Justin Hayes. Another man, this one in a business suit, not a security one, stepped out. He was in his late 30s with a thin, intelligent face and a tablet already in his hand. This was Ben Lawson, Natalie's chief of staff. He looked at the sagging porch, the peeling paint, and Dylan's mud-caked boots with a look of profound, controlled distaste. They were in the house in minutes. Caroline Morgan gave her medical report to Ben. Justin Hayes and his team secured the perimeter, their movements economical, their eyes cold. Jared Monroe simply blended back into the team, his face an impassive mask. Finally, Natalie Rivers emerged from Dylan's spare room, which had served as her holding area. She was transformed. Her hair was damp and pulled back, but she was dressed in a fresh, dark, expensive-looking outfit. The blood and mud were gone. Her arm was in a new, high-tech black sling. The CEO was back. She walked straight to Dylan, who was standing by the cold fireplace, his arms crossed. Ghost was at his side, his body a tense, solid wall. "Mr. Foster," Natalie said. Her voice was different, stronger. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by the crisp authority he'd only guessed at. "I don't have the words to adequately express my gratitude." "Just Dylan is fine," he said, "and no thanks necessary. Glad you're okay." "That's very kind," Ben Lawson interjected, stepping forward. "But Ms. Rivers insists on compensating you for your time, your assistance, and the use of your property. If you'll give me your account details, or perhaps we can write a check." Dylan's gaze, gray and flat, shifted to Ben. "I'm not for hire." Ben's professional smile flickered. "I'm not suggesting. It's just a gesture of gratitude for your trouble." "It wasn't trouble," Dylan said, his voice dropping. "It was a rescue." He looked back at Natalie. "I don't take money for that." Natalie held up her good hand, stopping her assistant. She understood. She had seen the pride in this man, had seen the way he fixed the generator, the way he lived. "Ben, wait outside," she said. Ben looked like he wanted to argue, but a look from his boss sent him and the rest of the team back to the porch, leaving Dylan, Natalie, and Ghost in the sudden quiet of the living room. "He's right," Natalie said softly. "It wasn't a transaction, but you saved my life. Twice. My dog did, you mean?" Dylan glanced down at Ghost, who was still watching Natalie. "He's your dog," she countered. "Please, I can't just walk away. Let me do something." Dylan was silent for a long time. He thought of the pile of envelopes on the table. He thought of the roof. He thought of Samantha. "You really want to pay me?" he said, his voice a low gravel. "Anything," she said. He walked to the oak table and shuffled through the pile of letters. He pulled out the single, most intimidating one. The final notice from the hospital's oncology department. He walked back and held it out to her. "This," he said, "this is the debt. You pay this, and—" He motioned toward the window. "My truck out there, a 1999 F-250. The transmission is gone. You fix that." He looked her in the eye, his own gaze unwavering, almost challenging. "That's the fee. The truck and Samantha's bill. We'll call it even." Natalie took the envelope from his hand, her fingers brushing his. She looked at the red past due stamp and the terrifying cold language of medical billing. She saw the name, Samantha Foster. She looked up at him, her eyes finally understanding the shape of the ghost in this house. "Okay, Dylan," she whispered. "Okay, that's the fee." 10 minutes later, she was gone. The SUVs tore through the mud, a caravan of wealth and power, leaving the farmhouse in a silence that was heavier and more absolute than the storm had been. For 3 days, that silence held. Dylan woke, fed Ghost, walked the perimeter, and stared at the roof. The truck was still there. The debt he assumed was being handled. He was alone again, and he found himself unsettled. The house, which had been his sanctuary, now felt empty. The adrenaline was gone, leaving the old familiar ache. On the 4th day, a generic white panel van with no markings came up the drive. It was not the mailman. Ghost was at the window, a low, uncertain growl in his chest, before Dylan even heard the engine. A man in a plain uniform dropped a single padded bubble mailer on the porch, took a photo of it, and then drove away. Dylan stared at it. There was no return address, just his name and the farm's address, neatly typed. How did they even know his name? He brought it inside, laying it on the table. Ghost sniffed it, his nose wrinkling. "What is it, boy?" Dylan murmured. He tore open the top. A few 446 glossy photos fell out onto the oak table. His blood went cold. The first was a picture of him, taken from a long distance, standing on the porch. The second was of his truck, the license plate clearly visible. The third was of Ghost, sitting in the living room window, taken through the glass, a perfect shot of the dog's gray and white head. They were the photos Jared Monroe had taken. At the bottom of the envelope was a single piece of folded paper. He opened it. 5 words were typed in the same clean font. "Stay away from what isn't yours. Nice dog." Dylan stared at the last 2 words. A threat against him he could have ignored. He was a veteran. He had been threatened by professionals. But this was different. This was a violation. They were threatening his dog. They were threatening Ghost. A cold, familiar rage, the kind he hadn't felt since his last tour, settled into his chest. He was no longer a victim of debt. He was a target, and they had made the fatal mistake of telling him what they valued. He was pacing, his hands clenched, his breathing shallow. He was back in it, her world, her war. And she had brought it to his door. He found himself in the bedroom. He didn't remember walking there. His hand was resting on the nightstand, on the cool glass of a simple wooden frame. It was a photo of him and Samantha, taken years ago, before the army, before the sickness. They were on a hiking trip at Crater Lake. She was smiling, her head thrown back, her dark hair a wild mess in the wind. He was looking at her, not the camera, a younger man's smile on his face. He picked it up. "Sam," he whispered. The guilt was a physical weight. He had survived. She hadn't. He was alive, and his life was a mess of debt and memories. And now he had allowed this new danger, this billionaire's world, to touch the sanctuary he had built on her memory. He felt like he was betraying her just by being part of this new, violent story. He sat on the edge of the bed, the threatening note in one hand, the picture of his wife in the other. He was torn. Ghost, sensing the shift, came in. The dog didn't whine. He didn't bark. He just walked up and pushed his heavy head under Dylan's arm, the one holding the photo. He pressed his body against Dylan's legs, a solid, living presence. "I am here. Now. Dylan dropped the note and wrapped his arm around the dog, burying his face in Ghost's ruff, anchoring himself. It was at that exact moment, in the depths of his conflict, that a new sound reached them. The distinct, familiar growl of the local UPS truck coming up the drive. Dylan, his heart still pounding, went to the door. The driver, a woman he knew, waved. "Got a next-day air for you, Dylan. Must be important." She handed him a sleek, dark gray box. It was heavy, professional, and bore the minimalist, stylish logo of Ether Dynamics. He brought it inside and set it on the table, next to the threatening photos. He opened it. Inside, on a bed of dark foam, was a thick, cream-colored card. It was a formal invitation. "You are cordially invited to the unveiling of Project Valkyrie." It was for the gala in Portland, in 2 days. Underneath it was a smaller, personal card, handwritten on the same expensive stock. "I need you to see what you saved. NR." And under that, one last item. Tucked into the foam was a heavy-duty collar crafted from thick black leather with a simple, solid, matte silver tag. Engraved on it was one word: Ghost. Dylan stared at the invitation. He looked at the anonymous photos, at the note, "Nice dog." He looked at the new, strong collar. The decision clicked into place with the cold, hard finality of a rifle bolt. They thought he was a hermit, a broken man in the woods. They thought they could scare him. They were wrong. They had threatened his partner. He wasn't going to Portland to be her guest. He was going to Portland to be Ghost's protector. He picked up the new collar, the leather strong and smooth in his scarred hand. He looked down at the shepherd, who was watching him with absolute trust. "Well, boy," Dylan said, his voice rough, "looks like we're going to Portland." The vehicle that arrived the next day was not a repaired F-250. It was a black, perfectly silent electric SUV that looked more like a piece of military hardware than a civilian car. The driver was one of Natalie's security team, a man who didn't speak, just nodded, and held the rear door open for Dylan. Ghost, wearing his new heavy leather collar, inspected the man's shoes, the tires, and the interior of the vehicle before he deemed it acceptable. He hopped in and sat on the floor, his head resting between the front seats, his eyes fixed forward. Dylan, feeling profoundly out of place in his best jeans and his newest-looking navy and beige plaid shirt, slid into the passenger seat. He had his duffel bag, which held 2 changes of clothes, his shaving kit, and the threatening photos at his feet. The drive to Portland was 3 hours of jarring sensory shifts. The dense, familiar quiet of the mountain logging roads gave way to the steady hum of the highway, and finally to the chaotic, sharp-edged noise of the city. Dylan watched the glass towers of the Pearl District rise up to replace the Douglas firs, each one a monument to a world he did not understand. The SUV didn't bother with street-level parking. It descended into a private, brightly lit subterranean garage where the driver navigated to a reserved elevator. "This way, Mr. Foster." The elevator opened not into a lobby, but directly into the apartment. The word apartment felt wrong. It was a penthouse occupying the entire top floor of the gleaming new building. The walls were glass, revealing a staggering 180-degree view of Portland and the river. The furniture was minimal, expensive, and looked like it had never been sat on. The entire space was larger than his farmhouse, and it was sterile, silent, and cold. "Miss, Rivers felt you and your partner would be more secure here," the driver said, setting Dylan's bag down. "Your access is biometric. The elevator will not open for anyone else. Groceries and supplies are stocked. Enjoy your stay." He was gone before Dylan could say a word. The heavy door slid shut with a sound like a vault closing, a quiet, definitive hiss. Dylan stood in the center of the vast marble-floored room, feeling like a speck of dust on a microchip. Then he felt a familiar presence. Ghost, who had been standing at his heel, let out a low, almost silent whine. He wasn't scared. He was processing. "Yeah, boy," Dylan said, his voice sounding too loud in the empty space. "Me too." But Ghost was a professional. His civilian life was over, and his training had returned. He began to work. Dylan watched as the shepherd, with a seriousness that was almost human, began a systematic patrol of the penthouse. He didn't run. He walked, his paws clicking on the polished floor. He started at the elevator, sniffing the threshold. He moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his cold nose brushing the glass as he looked down at the city lights far below. He went into the kitchen, a gleaming expanse of stainless steel, and methodically sniffed every cabinet. He checked both guest bedrooms, the master suite, and the laundry room. He spent a full minute at the air conditioning return vent, his head cocked, listening. After 15 minutes, he had cleared the entire space. He returned to Dylan, who was still standing by his bag, and sat at his feet. He looked up, let out a single, quiet huff, and then lay down, his head on his paws, facing the elevator. The perimeter was secure. "Good work, partner," Dylan said, finally allowing himself to move. "Reckon you've got first watch." He spent the rest of the day in that glass cage, feeling like a zoo exhibit. He didn't touch the expensive food. He didn't turn on the television, which was the size of his truck's hood. He stood, he paced, and he watched the city, his hand never far from Ghost's fur. The call came the next morning on a secure phone provided for him. It wasn't Natalie. It was her assistant, Ben Lawson. "Mr. Foster, good morning. Miss Rivers would like to formally invite you to tour the Ether Dynamics campus. She'd like to thank you in person. A car will be downstairs in 30 minutes. Dylan looked at Ghost. "I don't go anywhere without my partner." There was a pause on the line. Ben's voice was smooth, but Dylan could hear the faint, unpracticed irritation of a man used to getting his way. "A dog, Mr. Foster? In the R&D labs?" "He's not a dog," Dylan said, his voice flat. "He's a canine. He was invited. You've seen the pictures." Another pause, this one longer. Dylan heard the faint tapping of a keyboard. "Ah," Ben said, his tone shifting. "I see. Yes, my apologies. Ms. Rivers has already cleared Ghost with a Tier 1 Security +1 designation. Of course, the car will be waiting. For both of you." The Ether Dynamics campus was not a building, it was a statement. It was a collection of glass and steel structures that seemed to grow organically from a perfectly manicured landscape. Ghost, heeling so perfectly his shoulder brushed Dylan's leg, walked past sculptures and fountains, his head high, his demeanor all business. People stared. Men and women with brilliant minds and expensive shoes stopped and watched the man in the plaid shirt and the massive shepherd walk through their temple of innovation. Natalie met them in the main lobby. She was in her element. She wore a sharp charcoal gray suit, her broken arm in a sleek black sling that looked like a high-tech accessory. She radiated energy and command. "Dylan, welcome," she said, her smile warm. She then crouched slightly, ignoring Dylan, and held her good hand out, palm down, for the dog. "Ghost, it is good to see you again. Thank you for coming." Ghost leaned forward, sniffed her hand, and gave it a single, respectful lick. "He's approved," Dylan said. "High praise," Natalie smiled, standing. She turned, her pace brisk. "Come, let me show you what you saved." She led them through biometric scanners, past glass-walled labs where people were working with holographic displays and robotics. It was a different universe. Finally, she badged them into a high-security wing. The door was marked Valkyrie R&D. The lab was a massive open space filled with workstations, 3D printers, and a dozen engineers. At the center of it, on a pedestal, was a sleek, matte black drone that looked more like a predatory bird than a machine. A woman with short, dark hair and an intense, focused gaze approached them. She wore a lab coat, and her eyes, behind smart, thin-framed glasses, were tired but brilliant. "Dylan Foster, this is Brooke Taylor, my head of R&D, Natalie said. "Brooke, this is the man I told you about." "See." Brooke Taylor nodded, giving Dylan a quick, assessing glance. "Mr. Foster." She turned her attention to the problem at hand, picking up a small, incredibly complex component from a workbench. It looked like a metallic honeycomb, delicate and intricate. "We're stuck, Natalie," Brooke said, her frustration clear. "The sensor housing. We've run the simulations. The housing keeps overheating. We're getting signal degradation after 20 minutes. We've tried 5 different alloys. It's too delicate." Natalie looked at the component. "This is what was in the prototype?" "A variation, yes, but the core problem remains. It's an airflow issue." Dylan had been silent, standing at the edge of the group, a quiet, broad-shouldered shadow. Ghost was lying at his feet. "May I?" Dylan's voice, a low gravel, cut through the high-tech jargon. Brooke and Natalie both looked at him. He was pointing at the delicate component in Brooke's hand. Surprised, Brooke handed it to him. The contrast was startling. The intricate, almost fragile piece of cutting-edge technology rested in his scarred, calloused, and grease-stained hand. He turned it over, his thumb feeling the razor-thin edges of the fins. "This is your problem," he said. Brooke's eyebrows shot up. "I'm sorry?" "This," Dylan said, tapping the honeycomb vents. "It's beautiful. Looks like a jewel, but it's fragile. What's your field test?" "A climate-controlled chamber," Brooke said defensively. "We simulate wind, humidity, temperature extremes." "Simulate frost," Dylan said. "Simulate a mud dauber wasp building a nest. Simulate flying through a cloud of wet Oregon pine needles." He held the component up to the light. "These tiny vents, they'll clog in 10 minutes. The first time a little ice forms, your airflow is gone. The whole thing overheats. It's too delicate." Brooke looked offended. "And your solution, Mr. Foster?" Dylan looked past her at the massive digital whiteboard on the wall. "Can I?" He walked to the board, picked up a black marker. The engineers in the lab stopped their work watching him. He didn't draw a complex diagram. He drew a simple, robust, curved shape. "When I was in the service," he said, his back to them, his voice filling the room, "we had to keep desert sand out of the turbine intakes on the M1 tanks. The filters looked a lot like this. And they failed, just like this." He drew an arrow. "You're trying to guide the air. You need to force it. You're building a race car for a world that needs a tractor." He sketched a solid, simple shield. "You don't need these tiny fins. That's a fool's game. You need a solid shield, curved like this. It protects the sensor. Then you put 2 larger vents here and here. You create a vortex. It'll keep itself clean. It's heavier, it's uglier, but it will not ever clog. It'll work in mud, it'll work in sand, and it'll work in ice." He finished the sketch. It was simple, almost crude, but it was brutally practical. Brooke Taylor stared at it. She, a woman with 2 PhDs, was staring at a solution drawn from the guts of a tank engine. She ran the physics in her head. The vortex, the increased airflow, the durability. She looked at Dylan, her expression of skepticism replaced by one of dawning realization. Dylan, suddenly aware that the entire multi-million-dollar lab was silent and staring at him, felt deeply uncomfortable. He capped the marker and put it down, wiping the black dust on his jeans. "Anyway," he shrugged, his voice quiet again. "That's just how I'd keep a truck running in the mud." He walked back to his partner. Ghost, who had been watching him the whole time, thumped his heavy tail once on the polished floor. Natalie Rivers was watching the exchange, a slow, calculated smile forming on her face. She had been right about him. The eve of the gala. The penthouse, which had felt like a sterile cage, was now a command center. Ben Lawson, Natalie's assistant, was at the massive dining table, his laptop open, flanked by 2 other members of the Ether Dynamics team. Justin Hayes, the head of security, was on a video call in the corner, his voice a low, urgent murmur. Dylan Foster stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the lights of Portland glitter like a field of cold diamonds. He felt profoundly, absurdly out of place. Natalie had insisted on appropriate attire. A courier had delivered a simple, perfectly tailored dark gray suit, a white shirt, and a black tie. He was wearing a costume, and it felt like a betrayal of the man in the plaid shirt. Ghost lay at his feet, his head on his paws, facing the room. He was the only thing that felt real. The press check-in is at 5, podium at 7, Ben was saying. We've swept the auditorium 3 times. Justin? Justin Hayes finished his call and walked over. Perimeter is tight. My team is in place. But I'm telling you, Natalie, Derek Miles is on the guest list, and he accepted. Of course he did, Natalie Rivers said, her voice sharp. She had been pacing, a caged and restless energy. She wore simple black trousers and a silk blouse, her broken arm in its high-tech sling. He wants a front-row seat to see if I fail. Let him come. I want him to see us win. A sudden soft chime echoed through the room. It was the elevator. Ben Lawson looked up, confused. I wasn't expecting... Ghost was on his feet before the chime had faded. He didn't bark. He just stood, his body tensing, his gaze locked on the metal doors. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper-quiet hiss. A man stood there, smiling. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Dylan's farm equipment, with a perfectly styled sweep of silver-gray hair. His face was handsome, practiced, and his smile was a weapon of immense charm. Ben, Justin, the man said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. You all look so serious. It's a party, not an invasion. He stepped into the room, his eyes finding Natalie. Natalie, darling, you look radiant. I heard a rumor you were in town. This was Derek Miles, CEO of Miles Industries. Derek, Natalie said, her voice dropping 20 degrees, you're not welcome here. Nonsense, he breezed, walking past her team as if they were furniture. He was an apex predator, comfortable in any territory. His gaze landed on Dylan, and he paused, his practiced smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. He was assessing this new, unexpected piece on the board. Well, Derek said, his charm recalibrating. And who is this? I don't believe I've had the pleasure. This is Dylan Foster, Natalie said, her voice clipped. A consultant. A consultant, Derek repeated, his eyes raking over Dylan. He noted the suit's good fit and the rough, scarred hands of the man inside it. He noted the way the man stood, not like a businessman, but like a guard. Derek Miles, he said, extending a perfectly manicured hand toward Dylan. A pleasure, Mr. Foster. Derek took one step toward him. Ghost moved. It was not fast. It was not aggressive. It was a silent, deliberate, and final movement. The 90-pound shepherd rose from Dylan's side, walked the 2 steps, and planted himself directly between the 2 men. He did not look at Derek. He faced forward, his body a solid wall of gray and white fur. And then a sound. It was a low, almost subaudible rumble, a vibration that started deep in the shepherd's chest and seemed to shake the floor. It was the sound of a very large, very controlled engine idling in neutral, making it clear it could shift into gear at any second. Derek Miles froze, his hand still extended. His smile became a fixed, plastic thing. My, Derek said, his voice losing some of its smoothness. Protective, isn't he? A bit overdramatic for a house pet. Dylan, who had not moved, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but in the tense room, it cut through everything. He's not a pet. The silence in the room stretched, a taut wire. Derek's gaze flicked from the dog to Dylan and finally to Natalie. He had seen what he needed to see. This wasn't a business meeting. This was a fortress. And she had a new guard dog. He slowly lowered his hand and chuckled, a forced, hollow sound. So she does. Well, Natalie, I'm glad to see you're well protected. I just came to wish you luck. You'll need it. He turned, gave Ben and Justin a final dismissive nod, and stepped back into the elevator. See you at the launch. I wouldn't miss it for the world. The doors slid shut, and he was gone. The room exhaled. Ben was already on his phone. Get me a full security sweep of the lobby. I want to know how he got that elevator authorization now. Ben, Natalie cut him off. Justin, go. Handle it. I'll be down in an hour. Her team, sensing her tone, gathered their things and left, one by one, until the elevator chimed, descended, and the penthouse was silent again. It was just Dylan, Natalie, and Ghost. Ghost, after staring at the elevator doors for a full minute, finally walked back to Dylan and sat, leaning his weight against the man's leg. Dylan reached down, his hand burying itself in the thick fur of Ghost's ruff. He looked at Natalie, who was staring at the elevator, her expression a mask of cold fury. "My dog doesn't like him," Dylan stated. It wasn't an opinion. It was a fact. Natalie let out a long, shaky breath. She looked at Dylan, at his quiet, unshakable certainty. She looked at Ghost, a creature of pure, incorruptible instinct. That dog, in 48 hours, had saved her from a fall, and now had confirmed her deepest suspicions. "You're right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's not a good man." "He wants Valkyrie," Dylan said. "He wants more than that," Natalie said, her voice raw. "He wants to destroy me. He wants to see me fail." Dylan frowned. "It's just a drone, Natalie. A piece of tech. Why? What is this really about?" Natalie looked at him, truly looked at him. The man who had saved her. The man who had helped her R&D team. The man who had come here, bringing his only partner to stand by her. She had been protecting this secret from her board, from her investors, from the world. But she was tired of fighting alone. "Come with me," she said. "I need to show you something, not as a consultant, as the man who pulled me from that wreck." She led him from the living area into the penthouse's private office, a smaller room dominated by a large, dark-screened desk. She sat, her fingers flying over the keyboard, Ghost and Dylan following, standing behind her. "You asked me at the farm why I was in such a hurry," she said, her back to him. "I told you I was racing against a clock. I didn't tell you the truth." A file appeared on the massive screen. It wasn't a business plan. It was a series of medical images, brain scans, MRIs, showing the unmistakable, stark white lesions on a human spinal cord. "This is my clock," she whispered. Dylan leaned closer, his eyes narrowing, though he didn't understand the images. "I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 2 years ago," Natalie said, the words falling into the silent room like stones. "It's progressive. Some days I'm fine. Some days I can't feel my hands. One day I won't be able to walk. One day I won't be able to run my company." She turned in her chair to face him, her eyes bright with an unshed, angry-looking moisture. "Valkyrie isn't just a drone, Dylan. The AI, the advanced stabilization, the neural interface we're testing, it's a test platform. The real technology, the real Project Valkyrie, is to give people like me control again. To run wheelchairs, to move robotic arms, to communicate. It's to give me back my life." Dylan's own grief, his own past, suddenly snapped into a new perspective. He finally understood the desperate energy, the panic in her eyes when she woke up at his farm. "Derek Miles knows," she continued, her voice hardening. "A leak from my medical team 6 months ago. He's been trying to buy my company ever since. He's not just trying to steal the tech, he's trying to delay it, to bleed me dry, wait for my diagnosis to go public, and then buy Ether Dynamics for pennies when the stock collapses." "Your crash," Dylan said, the words feeling heavy. "The NTSB report was inconclusive," Natalie said, pulling up a new file. "They blamed mechanical failure due to the storm, but I knew I did my pre-flight." The screen filled with high-resolution photographs from the NTSB investigation. The wreckage, the engine, the fuel lines. Dylan leaned in, his eyes scanning the images with an expertise no one else in this city possessed. "Let me see. Go back." She did. He pointed. "That one. The fuel line. Zoom in." The image resolved, showing the severed edge of the braided steel line. "I'm a mechanic, Natalie," Dylan said, his voice a low, cold rumble. "A combat engineer. I've spent my life fixing things, and I've seen what happens when they're meant to break." He pointed to the screen, his finger tracing the edge of the break. "Vibration, stress. That makes a fracture. It's jagged. It splinters. This is clean. The edge is too precise. This wasn't a failure. This was cut." He looked away from the screen, his gray eyes meeting hers. The kindness was still there, but it was now forged into steel. "I've seen IEDs. I've seen what purposeful patient damage looks like. Someone used a specialized tool to score this line. They knew it would hold for a while, maybe an hour, and then break apart under high pressure and vibration." He stood up straight, the full, terrible weight of his words settling between them. "This wasn't an accident, Natalie. It was sabotage. He didn't just—" The Portland Convention Center pulsed with the low thrum of 1,000 conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the eager anticipation of a major tech unveiling. The main auditorium, typically reserved for rock concerts, had been transformed into a sleek, minimalist temple of innovation. Blue and white lights washed over a massive stage where the veiled form of Valkyrie waited under a spotlight. Dylan Foster stood near the back by a bank of fake potted palms, feeling like an alien in a badly fitting human suit. The tailored gray suit, the crisp white shirt, the black tie, they were all expensive and utterly alien. He felt the phantom itch of his old flannel, the comfortable weight of his worn leather jacket. He'd shaved for the first time in months, and his face felt strangely naked. The noise of the crowd, the bright shifting lights, the relentless murmur of conversation. It was all a sensory assault, and the old tightness in his chest was a familiar, unwelcome guest. Ghost was not there. Dylan had left him in the penthouse. It felt wrong, leaving his partner, his anchor, behind. But the security protocols for the gala were absolute. No animals, no exceptions. As if sensing his unease, Dylan's secure phone, tucked into his inner jacket pocket, vibrated. It was a text from Natalie Rivers. "He's okay, I promise. You can check the cameras anytime. It's on your phone." N.R. Dylan pulled out the phone. Sure enough, a new app icon labeled Penthouse Cam glowed on the screen. He tapped it. The live feed showed the living room of the penthouse. Ghost was lying exactly where Dylan had left him, by the window, his head up, surveying the city, as if he hadn't moved. A small, almost imperceptible wave of relief washed over Dylan. Natalie knew him better than he thought. She knew what he needed. He put the phone away, feeling a fraction more settled. Natalie herself was a force of nature. She was on stage now, bathed in the blue light, addressing the crowd. Her black floor-length gown glittered subtly, and her broken arm, still in its sling, looked less like an injury and more like a badge of honor. Her voice, amplified and confident, filled the massive hall. She spoke of Ether Dynamics' mission, of a future where technology empowered, where innovation served humanity. She spoke of Valkyrie not as a product, but as a promise. Dylan watched her. She was a warrior in her own right. He saw the fire in her eyes, the passion that drove her to fight against an illness that would destroy lesser people. He understood now why she was so desperate, why she was willing to risk everything. She was fighting for her life, for her future, and for the promise of a better world for others like her. His gaze drifted to the front row. There, perfectly framed by the camera that projected Natalie onto the Jumbotron screens, sat Derek Miles. Derek was impeccable in a charcoal gray suit, his silver hair glinting under the lights. He watched Natalie with an unreadable expression, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. Dylan felt Ghost's low growl, even from a mile away. Suddenly, Derek Miles moved. He rose from his seat, excusing himself to the people around him with a polite, practiced smile. He walked swiftly, discreetly, toward the rear exit of the auditorium. He did not look back. Dylan's internal alarm bells began to clang. It was too precise, too timed. Derek was leaving just as Natalie was nearing the climax of her presentation, just before the unveiling. He wasn't leaving out of boredom. He was leaving to do something. Dylan pulled out his phone again, but not to check on Ghost. He pulled up the secure messaging app Natalie had installed for him. Miles just exited the main hall. Back left exit. He typed, sending it to Natalie and Justin Hayes. A second later, his phone buzzed again, this time with an urgent, silent notification. It wasn't a text message, it was a system alert. Ether Dynamics Internal Security, Alert Level 3. Breach detected. Server room. Unauthorized access attempt. Main databank. Dylan stared at the message, his blood running cold. Server room A, the main databank. This wasn't a coincidence. Derek had left the auditorium and a security alert had triggered, almost to the second. This was a classic diversion. A feint. He knew it from his combat days. You draw attention to one area to create a window of opportunity somewhere else. His mind raced. If Derek was orchestrating this, then the breach at the server room was designed to pull security away from the real target. What was the real target? What would Natalie value more than her main servers, which would be backed up and protected by multiple redundancies? Then it hit him. The penthouse. His eyes darted to the live camera feed of the penthouse on his phone screen. Ghost was still there, lying by the window. Quiet, safe. But was he? The data from the crash, the photos from the NTSB, the internal reports, her personal computer, her private medical files, all of that would be in her personal residence. And she had probably done a manual backup to her penthouse computer just in case the server room was compromised. That would be the real prize. That would be the vulnerability. And he had left Ghost alone in that vulnerability. He felt a sudden, sickening jolt of fear. He had been so focused on protecting Ghost from external threats, from the anonymous niece dog message, that he had forgotten to protect Ghost from this. From the subtle, professional high-stakes game that Derek Miles played. His phone vibrated again, a new system alert. Ether Dynamics, Internal Security, Alert Level 4, Breach Detected. Server Room, External Network Initiated. Data Exfiltration Attempt. The main server room was under active attack. This was no longer just an attempt. They were trying to steal data. Dylan's training kicked in. He had to assume Derek was good. He had to assume this Level 4 breach was a high-profile distraction, specifically designed to draw Justin Hayes and his team away from the real target. The real target had to be the penthouse. He remembered Natalie's words, the easy, trusting way she'd given him access to the penthouse camera. I know you're worried about leaving Ghost alone. You can check on him anytime. But that wasn't just a comfort. It was a warning. It was the only warning he had. He looked at the stage. Natalie was still speaking, passionate, brilliant, utterly oblivious to the silent battle unfolding around her. The crowd was captivated. He had to act, but he couldn't leave Ghost alone. He couldn't just call the building security. They would rush to the server room, leaving the penthouse unguarded. He couldn't trust anyone in Natalie's security detail, not after Jared Monroe. He pulled up the secure messaging app again. He needed to be precise. He needed to be quick. Server room A is a diversion. Penthouse is the target. Get security to Penthouse 2301 now, he typed, sending it directly to Justin Hayes. Then, before he could second-guess himself, Dylan turned and began to move. He moved with a speed and purpose that cut through the glittering crowd like a knife. He wasn't a guest anymore. He was a soldier. He was going to the penthouse. The gala floor was a sea of black suits and glittering dresses, a current of polite, amplified noise. Dylan Foster was the only one moving against the tide. He pushed through the crowd, his movements no longer awkward, but economical and dangerous. The Level 4 alert on his phone was still flashing. System-wide breach. Data exfiltration. In progress. It was a siren. It was loud, bright, and to Dylan's combat-trained mind, utterly false. A real data theft, a professional one, would be a ghost. It would be silent. This was a brass band. This was a diversion, a look-over-here maneuver designed to pull every ounce of Ether's security, every guard, every analyst, and Justin Hayes himself, to that one server room. It was a feint, and Dylan knew with the cold, sick certainty of a veteran that a feint only works when it's protecting a real primary attack. He was almost at the exit when his phone buzzed again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the red flashing Ether security app. It was a simple, gray push notification from the camera app Natalie had installed. Motion detected. Penthouse Living Room. The words hit Dylan like a physical blow. He stopped dead, a solid, unmoving rock in the flow of the gala crowd. The server room wasn't just a diversion, it was the anvil. The penthouse was the hammer. Derek Miles had split his forces. He had created a massive, system-wide crisis to guarantee that Natalie's entire security team would be looking one way, while a single, quiet operative, under the cover of that chaos, hit the real target. Natalie's personal laptop, the one with her backups, her medical files, the real data. And the only thing in that penthouse was Ghost. The only reason Dylan knew was because of that camera. The camera Natalie had given him not for security, but for peace of mind, to check on his dog. "Oh, God," Dylan whispered, his blood turning to ice. He was no longer a soldier. He was just a man whose dog was in a room with an intruder. He bolted, shouldering his way through the service doors, his heart pounding a deafening, panicked rhythm against his ribs. He ran for the elevators, his biometric access, his only hope. He had to be faster. The penthouse, 23 floors above the city, was silent. The polished marble floor was cold. The city lights, twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, cast long, distorted shadows. Ghost was lying by the window, his head on his paws. He was not asleep. He was at ease, a state of low-level professional alertness. Then a sound. It was a sound that did not belong, not the hum of the climate control, not the distant city traffic. It was the faint, oily hiss of the private elevator doors sliding open. Ghost was on his feet in a single, fluid motion. He did not bark. He did not growl. His canine training was absolute. A bark was an alarm. A growl was a warning. This was neither. This was an infiltration. He melted back into the deepest shadows of the room, near the unlit kitchen, his gray and white coat making him a phantom. Ross Mitchell stepped out of the elevator. He was a professional, dressed in dark, soft-soled shoes and a nondescript technician's uniform. He carried a heavy tool bag. He had used a cloned keycard, supplied by Jared Monroe's earlier intel, and timed his entry to coincide with the server room breach. He knew the building's internal security was now offline, its attention diverted. He moved quickly, his small pen light sweeping the room. He saw the empty wine glasses, the dark kitchen, the massive television. He saw no one. He didn't see the dog, because the dog was not a pet. The dog was a shadow. Mitchell moved to the office nook where Natalie's personal laptop sat. This was the prize. He smiled, setting his bag down. He pulled out a small, complex-looking device, a hardware data cloner. "Easy money," he muttered to himself, clicking open the laptop. He frowned. It required a thumbprint. He pulled another device from his bag, a bypass tool. He was focused, his attention lasered in on the small, glowing screen. He never heard the 90 pounds of silent muscle approaching from his left. Ghost had stalked him from the kitchen, his paws making no sound on the marble. He watched the strange man. He smelled the strange man, an unfamiliar, sharp scent of metal and sweat. He identified the man as an unknown, a threat in his master's territory. Mitchell, frustrated, hit the side of the laptop. He felt a sudden, strange shift in the air, a primal instinct making the hair on his neck stand up. He thought he heard a low huff of breath. He turned. He was too late. He had a brief, confused impression of immense size, of pale gray fur, and two dark, intelligent eyes. Ghost did not lunge at his throat. He did not maul. He executed a perfect, trained maneuver. As Ross Mitchell turned, his right arm coming up, Ghost sprang. He clamped his powerful jaws down on the man's forearm, the one holding the bypass tool. The impact was brutal. The man's scream was cut short as Ghost's full weight slammed into him, knocking him backward off the stool. He hit the floor hard, the air driven from his lungs. Ross Mitchell stared in white-hot agony at the dog. The shepherd had not released its grip. It was not shaking its head. It was simply holding, its jaws locked, its muscles rigid. It was a bite and hold. A living, breathing man-trap. Mitchell tried to pull his arm free, but the pressure was immense, a vice grip crushing bone and muscle. He screamed. The elevator doors at the penthouse level opened, and Dylan burst out. He was expecting gunfire, a fight, a terrible bloody scene. he was met with a different kind of tableau. The room was still dark, but from the office nook he heard a desperate, pained sobbing. He ran, his heart in his throat. He found Ross Mitchell on the floor, on his back, his face a mask of sweat and terror. And standing over him, as still and solid as a stone gargoyle, was Ghost. Ghost's jaws were locked onto the man's forearm. His front paws were planted firmly on the floor. He was not moving, just holding his prisoner, his eyes calm and focused. Dylan's breath came out in a rush of pure, unadulterated relief. The fear for his partner vanished, replaced by a surge of overwhelming pride. At that exact moment, the elevator chimed again. The doors opened, and Justin Hayes and 2 of his security team spilled out, weapons drawn, expecting a firefight. "Freeze!" Justin yelled, leveling his sidearm. They all stopped, stunned by the scene. The intruder, neutralized, the laptop, safe, and the dog, in absolute control. Ross Mitchell, seeing the armed men, started sobbing again. "Get it off me! Please, get it off!" Justin looked at Dylan, his eyes wide, his weapon still raised. Dylan never took his eyes off his partner. He stepped forward, his voice calm, firm, and full of authority. "Ghost," he said. The dog's ears flicked, but his jaws remained locked. "Ghost, aus." It was the German command. Out. Instantly, as if a switch had been flipped, Ghost released his grip and stepped back. He sat, his chest high, his gaze never leaving the intruder. A small, satisfied huff of air escaped his nostrils. Justin Hayes and his team moved in, cuffing the weeping man, one of them quickly applying a tourniquet to the badly bleeding arm. Justin looked at the bite marks, at the professional single point of contact neutralization. He looked at the dog, who was now patiently waiting for his next command. Then he looked at Dylan. "You said Penthouse is the target," Justin said, his voice shaky with adrenaline. Dylan didn't answer. He knelt beside his partner, his hand going to the thick gray ruff. He checked Ghost's mouth, his fur, his paws. He was fine. "Good boy," Dylan whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that had nothing to do with the night's victory. "Good boy. Good watch." Ghost leaned his massive head against Dylan's chest, a silent, mutual acknowledgement. The battle was over. Their perimeter was secure. The chaos of the penthouse was, in its own way, a perfect, sudden stillness. Dylan Foster was on one knee, his hand buried in the thick fur of Ghost's ruff, his thumb checking the dog's gums for any sign of injury. "Good boy. Good watch," he whispered, his voice thick with a relief so profound it almost buckled him. Ghost just leaned his heavy head against Dylan's chest, a low, rumbling groan of satisfaction vibrating through them both. "Jesus," Justin Hayes, the head of security, said, his voice shaky. He had holstered his weapon and was now helping his team secure the sobbing intruder. Ross Mitchell was on his stomach, his arm, now free of the dog. A bloody mess. "He's the one," Mitchell gasped, tears of pain and terror streaming down his face. "He's the one you want, not me. It was Jared Monroe. He hired me. He gave me the security bypass. He said the dog was just a pet." Justin's head snapped up. He tapped his earpiece, his voice now a blade of cold steel. "All teams, level 1, find and detain Jared Monroe. He is hostile. I repeat, find Monroe, now." He looked at Dylan, his eyes a mix of awe and bewilderment. "The server room breach? It just vanished. A ghost signal. You were right. It was a feint." "He threatened my dog," Dylan said, as if that explained everything. To him, it did. The elevator chimed, and Ben Lawson, Natalie's assistant, burst in, his face pale. "What happened? The server alarm? Justin, what's—" He stopped, his eyes widening at the blood, the intruder, the dog, and Dylan kneeling in the middle of it all. "The gala," Dylan said, standing, the soldier's calm returning. "She's still on stage." "I'll handle this," Justin said, nodding to Ben. "Get back to her. Do not let her leave that stage until I have a full all clear." The scene shifted back to the convention center. On stage, Natalie Rivers was taking her final bow. The demonstration of the Valkyrie prototype, The one Dylan's practical advice had helped finalize had been a staggering success. The crowd was on its feet, the applause a rolling wave of thunder. She smiled, her good hand raised, but her eyes were scanning the back of the room for Dylan. He wasn't there. In the grand lobby, the trap snapped shut. Jared Monroe, the spy, was caught making a quiet exit toward a side door, his face a mask of panic. Justin's team was on him before he'd taken 3 steps. And then, the main event. Derek Miles was standing near the grand staircase, a glass of champagne in his hand. He was watching Natalie's triumph on a large monitor, his expression one of sour, cold fury. He was waiting for a call. The call from Ross Mitchell, confirming the data theft. It was a call that would never come. Instead, Justin Hayes approached, flanked by 2 uniformed Portland police officers who had been hired for event security. "Derek," Justin said, his voice dangerously calm. "Justin, a fine party," Derek replied, his mask of charm still perfectly in place, though Natalie seems to have overpromised as usual. "Derek Miles," Justin said, his voice cutting through the lobby noise. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit industrial espionage, aggravated assault, and the sabotage of a private aircraft." The blood drained from Derek's face. The mask didn't just crack, it shattered. "This is absurd. You have no—" "We have Ross Mitchell," Justin said. "We have Jared Monroe, and we have a witness who saw you at the airport hangar the night before Ms. Rivers' flight." The champagne glass slipped from Derek's hand, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was as sharp and final as a gavel. The nearby crowd went silent. Camera flashes began to erupt as the officers cuffed him. The CEO, the titan of industry, was being led away, his face a mottled, ugly mask of rage. His reign was over. It was almost 3 in the morning when Natalie and Dylan returned to the penthouse. The mess had been cleaned, the blood scrubbed from the marble. The only sign of the night's violence was a faint antiseptic smell. Ghost was asleep, truly asleep, for the first time at the foot of the couch. He didn't even lift his head when they entered. His watch was over. Natalie, still in her gown, her sling discarded on a chair, walked to the great glass window and looked out at the city. She was exhausted, her body thrumming with adrenaline and relief. "They're both talking," she said to the glass. "Mitchell and Monroe. They're giving the DA everything. The sabotage, the data theft, Jared's connection to the NTSB leaks. It's all connected. It's done, Dylan. It's finally done." She turned to him. He was standing in the shadows, his tie and suit jacket gone, his white shirt rolled up to his elbows. He looked like the man from the farm again, just in a different setting. "You didn't just save me, Dylan," she said, her voice soft. "You saved this company. You saved Valkyrie. You saved everything." She walked to him, stopping a few feet away. "Your solution in the R&D lab. Brooke is already building a prototype. She says it's brutally practical. Your actions tonight, you saw the real threat, not the theoretical one. You saw the feint. My entire security team, with all their training, missed it." She took a deep breath. "I have enough theorists, Dylan. I have enough engineers staring at code. What I don't have is someone who knows how things break, someone who knows how to build things that last." She looked him in the eye, a CEO making a pitch, but also a woman making a plea. "I'm creating a new division, Head of Technical Security and Practical Application. It's a fancy title, but the job is to be my mechanic, my soldier, my practical eye, to go into my R&D labs and tell my brilliant, delicate engineers that their designs are going to fail in the mud, to find the Jared Monroes before they find me. I need you, Dylan." Dylan was silent for a long time. He looked at his hands, the scarred, calloused hands that had saved her, that had sketched the solution. He thought of his farm, of the crushing debt, of the silence. He thought of Samantha. "I'm not a tech guy, Natalie. I was a mechanic." "That's exactly why I need you," she said, her voice firm. "I don't need another tech guy. I need you, and I need him." She nodded at Ghost, sleeping peacefully. "He can be the new head of mascot relations, or our chief security consultant. Dylan looked at Ghost, then back at her. A new life, not one that erased the old, but one that built upon it. He saw the path forward. "Okay," he said, his voice rough. "Okay, I'll do it." 6 months later, the light was different. It wasn't the harsh blue of a gala or the cold glow of a penthouse. It was the warm, late-afternoon sun of a Portland autumn, filtering through the windows of a packed community center, a banner hung over a small stage. The Samantha Foster Veteran Support Fund grand opening. Dylan stood at the podium. He wasn't in a suit. He wore a simple dark blazer, his old plaid shirt softened beneath it. His beard was trimmed. The lines of worry on his face had eased, replaced by a quiet, settled strength. He looked healthy. "My wife, Samantha," he said, his voice steady, his hands resting on the wood. "She was a healer. She spent her life trying to fix things, people, animals, a garden. This fund, it isn't from me. It's from her. It honors her. And it's for the people who come back and need a little help finding their way." He finished his short, simple speech to a wave of warm applause. He stepped down, and Natalie was there, waiting for him. She wasn't a CEO today. She was just Natalie. She wore a simple knit sweater, and her hair was down. Her arm was long out of its sling, and she used her right hand, the one she'd broken, to hand him a bottle of water. The MS, he knew, was in a period of remission. The Valkyrie project, with his practical solutions, was leaps ahead of schedule. "She would have been proud of you, Dylan," Natalie said, her voice soft. "We did a good thing, Natalie," he replied. "We?" They walked out of the crowded hall, out into the crisp golden air. Ghost was waiting by the door. He was no longer just a canine, no longer just a support animal. He was a local celebrity, the official mascot of Ether Dynamics, and he wore a new, custom-made vest. He stood, his heavy tail thumping, and joined them. Dylan Foster, Natalie Rivers, and Ghost. They walked down the sunlit Portland street together. He was not a hermit. She was not just a patient. They were not two broken survivors. They were a family. Not a family born of blood, but one forged in fire, built on trust, and grounded in a profound, quiet respect. They were facing forward, honoring the past but not trapped by it, walking together into the new dawn. The bond between a veteran and his canine is a quiet promise, a reminder that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about having a partner who helps you get back up, whether they have 2 legs or 4. If Dylan and Ghost's journey touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you'd share it with someone who understands that loyalty. We read every comment and would be honored if you'd join our pack by subscribing. Our newest tale is waiting for you now. Just tap the video on your screen to continue the journey.